This is Mark Lane.
This is Robert Groden.
This is Dick Russell.
This is Jim Mars.
This is Lisa Pease.
This is Dr. David Mantic.
This is Cyril Weck.
This is Jim DiEugenio.
This is Joan Mellon.
This is Jerry Policott.
This is Gary Shaw.
This is Greg Burnham.
This is Gerald McKnight.
This is Sherry Feaster.
This is Dave Ratcliffe.
This is Doug Horn.
This is Bill Pepper.
This is Richard Belzer.
This is Oliver Stone.
This is Governor Jesse Ventura, and you're listening to Black Op Radio.
Video computers online. Archiving 44K. Initiate sequence.
T-minus 30 seconds.
Server connection confirmed.
T-minus 25 seconds.
Live stream 21 at 20K.
T-minus 20 seconds.
Phone lines are go.
T-minus 15 seconds.
Satellite uplink verified.
T-minus 10 seconds.
Flight check complete. Satellite uplink verified.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to Black Op Radio, the voice of political conspiracy research. You're listening to Black Op Radio, the show NSA doesn't want you to hear. Now here is your host, Len Osanic.
You're on the air.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Black Op Radio. In this episode we're going to be speaking to researcher Pat Speer and discussing again the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Hello Pat, welcome.
Hey Len.
Glad to have you back on the show. You were a contributor for the 50 Reasons series, so thank you very much for that.
Oh, my pleasure.
This spring, I've been talking about the House Select Committee on Assassinations and managed to get some audio of the actual hearings. And I think it's very important for people that are interested to listen to the actual audio and hear the inflections of the testimony given compared to what people think are just natural facts. And sometimes the other side wants to conclude that, oh, well, they've already gone through this and they've discovered that, it was a lone gunman after all. And the further you look into it, you find it's just not the case.
Oh, absolutely. The HSCA tapes are largely, it was, at the time they were broadcast on, a lot of them were broadcast on PBS live. And yet, there's so much footage on the internet. Where are they? No one really has them. And if you want them, you can contact the National Archives and they'll have someone make a copy for you. But it ends up being, I don't know, I think I figured it out about $30 or $40 an hour to have someone make a copy of the stuff. Fortunately, I found in my own research that the Poetry Library at Baylor University has some VHS that they got from researchers who were recording it on VCRs back in 1978, the early VCRs, and they turned around and made it available through the library. So if anybody's interested in seeing some of the video footage of the performances, because that's what they were. And I'll explain why in a second. You can get them most of them through the Baylor University for a reasonable price. I think I bought 2 DVDs of two different testimony, and it was about $10 a piece, so very reasonable.
Perfect. Send me an email, and I'll make that link available to others who are interested in that. But last week I had Robert Groden on, and I had him on ahead of time, so he gave a good, introduction to what was going on. And one of the key things that he said was that he was asked not to bring up certain topics. And in that case, he would be having time to develop those ideas later on. And of course, they never called him back. They never had him back. So they kind of hoodwinked him into going along with their scenario, in which case Blake, he didn't want some uncomfortable facts brought up, and then they act like, well, that's all there was to it, and we've exhausted every investigation, every investigative avenue that we've had, and we're under budget, so we're closing early.
Yeah, it was very much a show. They maybe a dog and pony show or whatever. It was very much a show that was put on by the staff. The congressmen themselves were basically like illiterate. They really didn't know what the facts were. And it was confirmed for me by Larry Sturdivan, one of the guys who testified, that they were the congressmen were provided a script on what they were supposed to ask. And sometimes they went off script. But what's interesting is I did a comparison of like Sturdivan's testimony and Boden's testimony versus the videos that I had. to see what was said versus what's in the transcripts. And there's a lot of words that are different, and sometimes to change the substance of what was said. But I noticed a lot of the questions were different too, and that's where Sturdivan told me. He says, "Oh, it's because if a congressman went off script, the staff would go turn around and change it back to the script in the transcript." So the whole thing was a show for the public, and it makes you really like if the purpose was to clarify what happened, why did they need a script? Why couldn't they just put the people on TV and clarify it? Another, like you said about Grodin kind of being told not to talk about things. Another person who testified for the HSCA that I've spoken to, and he's no longer with us, is Jack White. And I sent him a few emails, and Jack White and I didn't see eye to eye about the Zapruder film and a lot of other things. But he was the real deal. He wanted the truth to come out, and he was willing to talk about his own experiences. And he talked about the fact that they gave him a copy of his testimony and allowed him to change some of the words around to make it sound better. But he also talked about the fact that they sabotaged him. He was there on their behalf, talking about the fact that he thought the backyard photos were fake, I think it was, and they sabotaged him. They threw out this word, "What about photogrammetry?" And he hadn't used that word. He knew what the concept was, which is analyzing photos to try to understand the angles and stuff like that. But they set him up. They wanted to he was there as on his own, but they asked him to be there, and he was trying to help, and they set him up to make him look stupid, and he didn't appreciate that at all.
Yeah, I believe what they did is they asked him, what do you know about photogrammetry? And he said, well, that I'm not a specialist in that at all. Okay, well then thank you very much. That's all we have questions for. Right?
Well, yeah, what is your background? And he was a professional photographer, so he obviously knew a lot about photography and about what looked normal and what didn't look normal. And and like I said, I don't really agree with a lot of Jack White's conclusions, but the fact that he was supposed to be, in his mind, he was there to help them, and then they turned around and set him up like that because they wanted to discredit him. And but they did the same thing with Dr. Humes. The original autopsy, they said the bullet entered low on the back of the head, and then this other panel brought in to try to get rid of the conspiracy. To explain. In 1968, the Clark panel, as they're called, they moved the head wound and said the bullet entered towards the top of the head, and what people call a cowlick entry. And because that lined up better with this sixth floor, and it made the trajectory make more sense. So that's what they decided. And then, in 78, the Dr. Bodden testifies that it really did enter towards the top of the head, and the Clark panel's right. Well, that leaves this gaping hole that the autopsy doctors are in disagreement with the HSCA panel. So they put all this pressure on Dr. Humes to say that, no, I think they're right, that it really did enter towards the top of the head. And they threatened him. This is in Gary Cornwell, the assistant chief counsel for the HSCA. In his book, he admits he was planning on dragging Humes through the mud and talking about all the mistakes he made about the back wound and about all these lies he told and how incompetent he was. He was going to destroy his reputation. But then one of the doctors warned Humes that, hey, if you agree that the bullet entered towards the top of the head, we won't trash your reputation. So then Humes, starts to say that, I guess maybe it did enter towards the top of the head, and or it just looks like it's towards the he looks at the autopsy photo and he plays around with the word games like, well, maybe the skin has been stretched upwards or whatever, and he starts to do all this stuff. But they knew that was just for show, because they didn't even ask the other doctors if they thought it could enter top of the head. They didn't ask the radiologist or the radiology techs or all these other people who saw the bullet hole towards the bottom of the head. They didn't ask any of them if they thought the bullet entered the top of the head. So it was just for show, so that they could say, hey, it really did enter towards the top of the head. The end. That's what they wanted.
Shocking. Now, tell me a little more about Gary Cornwell, though, because I'm finding out that a lot of the people that you thought were in charge of this, from Blakey down, were supporters of a lone assassin. And this is just shocking, and it went right through to the Assassination Records and Review Board. That's just so surprising that you would bother having this kind of investigative arm of the government just being a facade, a total waste of time. This is, I think, what people have to have kind of illuminated. thanks to your good research, we're going to do that with Larry Sturdivan. But first of all, last week I did ask Robert Groden to name a few of the people that he thought were shady and not actually looking for the truth, and he kind of replied, well, he says, well, take your pick. I mean, I think he was implying that they all were. I don't want to just take a blanket statement. Is there any people that you have done research with that you want to point out? They might have had two agendas, one to put on a show and then just cover up real work?
I think that the staff, starting with Blakey, well, Andy Purdy, he was an assistant and who worked on the medical evidence and stuff. Purdy, he was a conspiracy theorist. He thought he was going to prove conspiracy, but he was under Blakey's sway. See, Blakey, when he came in, Blakey's attitude was, I'm not here to figure out who did it. I'm here to use science to answer some of these troubling questions we have. So he was really like all about, let's get these scientists all in line. Well, he didn't realize the medical panel were all buddies of the Clark panel, so they weren't really objective. Cyril Wecht was the only objective guy in the medical panel, and they separated him out. It was 9 guys on the medical panel, and they put Cyril Wecht in a special section of 3. The other 2 have already signed off on the Warren Commission's findings of a lone assassin. So they minimized his impact from the very beginning. And and I asked Robert Tannenbaum at a conference at the 50th anniversary conference in Pittsburgh, and I asked Robert Tannenbaum. I said, how did that the HSCA medical panel end up being all these guys that were all sycophants for Dr. Russell Fisher and the Clark panel? And he says, well, there was one guy I asked to be on the panel, and that was Cyril Wecht. So Cyril Wecht getting on the panel wasn't supposed to happen. It was that Tannenbaum, who was the original assistant counsel, who ended up quitting. We get into a whole story there. The original head of the HSCA staff was Richard Sprague, and he was going to treat it like it was a real murder. I mean, he was a district attorney heading an investigation into a murder, and he was going to turn over every stone, as they say, or leave no stone unturned, or whatever. He was going to look everywhere, the CIA, everybody. So anyhow, so his assistant was Tannenbaum, who was from New York City, and he also wanted to really go balls out, as they say, really go after it. And but they were about to lose their funding, so Sprague left, and then Tannenbaum ended up leaving, and so they were replaced by Blakey, who was considered to be not as controversial, not as scary. But Blakey, like I said, he wanted to have science answer the question, so he had a bias towards anything a scientist told him he was going to buy. And one of the first scientists who came in with his results was Dr. Vincent Gwynn, who did the neutron activation analysis on the magic bullet and also the Connolly wrist fragment, and he said they matched. And after he did that, everything changed. I noticed that after Thomas Canning, he was the one who kind of said that, but Kennedy really was leaning forward before he went behind the sign. In fact, as for some reason, I was the first person to realize this. If you look at Canning's testimony really clearly, and you really line it up and you figure out the angles he's talking about, he says that Kennedy was leaning forward before he went behind the sign, got shot, sat up in the car, and then got shot in the head. He's got it backwards because he was lining up wounds that didn't exist to try to make it all seem like it came from the 6th floor sniper's nest.
Right. Now, but to recap that, then you're saying that this medical panel were changing their testimony to fit what the photographic panel was stating?
The medical panel, they signed off on the single bullet theory, but they weren't going to say that Kennedy was leaning forward before he went behind the sign. In their estimation, he would have to have leaned forward behind the sign in order for the trajectory to work. But they didn't. So the HSCA staff brought in a trajectory expert from NASA named Thomas Canning, and it was his job to figure out when Kennedy was leaning forward enough for the bullet for the trajectory to work. And he said that Kennedy was leaning forward before he went behind the sign, which didn't make any sense. It's outright fraud. I mean, that's one of the things that I talked to Professor Blakey at the most recent conference in Bethesda, and I said, can I send you some information? And the information I sent him was all about how Thomas Canning's testimony says that Kennedy was leaning forward before he went behind the sign, sat up after he got shot, then got shot in the head. while he was sitting erect. But anybody who's seen the Zapruder film knows that Kennedy leans forward after initially getting shot. So it's the opposite, and that's what NASA, told the HSCA committee, and nobody argued with it. There's no dissent by any of the, there is a few dissents about Canning's work, but it's about other things. But it's not about the fact that he had Kennedy leaning forward before he went behind the sign. Nobody dissented on that. Maybe because the way he worded it, it was all doublespeak. It was totally Orwellian, I think, where he deliberately wrote this really hard to understand report that people just said, "Oh, he's from NASA. He knows what he's talking about." But it was bullshit. Sorry,
Oh, I don't mind at all. No. Anyway, I just kind of want to underscore that and make sure people get that clear, because that's the trickery, the dog and pony show, like you say. That before you know it, you're saying, "Well, what did that guy just say? Did he say that a single bullet's possible? I mean, it's impossible."
Yeah. Well, like I said, the medical panel thought, well, if Kennedy was leaning forward, it could hit him in his back, and he's leaning so far forward. As I can't remember who talks about it, maybe Jim or someone always talks about how maybe it's Cyril Weck, about they say he leaned forward to tie his shoes while he's behind the sign for 2 seconds. But that's I don't remember the exhibit. There was an exhibit that they put in their their report that shows how Kennedy would have to be leaning sharply forward for the bullet to make it through his neck without going, hitting him in the back and exit from his throat. But the irony of that is that if you look at the spinal column, they have the bullet going right through the first rib. It's like, hello. None of the drawings, the HSCA drawings, have the first rib on them. None of the medical panel drawings, because they have the bullet going through the first rib. And then, like I said, this guy Canning was brought in to sell this hunk of garbage called the single bullet theory. And Canning's drawings show the bullet passing over the first rib by half an inch over it or whatever.
Okay, so let's talk about the sections I'm going to play, and that's Dr. Sturdivan, Army Ballistics. What can you tell listeners about him and what we should know prior to listening to this?
A couple of interesting things about Larry Sturdivan is that he was brought in by the HSCA staff to sell the wound ballistics of the single bullet theory and the headshot. And he was actually a statistician and not a doctor of medicine. But Sturdivan's background is he worked for the ballistics laboratory that did the tests for the Warren Commission back in 1964. And his mentors were Dr. Zemian and Dr. Olivier, who did the tests for the Warren Commission. So he was there to basically report on what those guys had already told the Warren Commission. But so it's interesting. You look through in the HSC medical panel's report, at one point they kind of say, this is what we did before writing a report. And they only met with Sturdivan once. They met with him once. Meanwhile, Dr. Bodden, he made a speech in 1980 in Toronto, in Canada, before a panel of forensic scientists. And he talked about how he got his information on wound ballistics from, it's escaping my memory right now, but an Irish doctor who was involved in the Sunday Bloody Sunday massacre. And of course, later on it would come out that in that shooting in Ireland, Northern Ireland, some of the British soldiers had almost certainly used dum-dum bullets. But he thought it was all normal. So he might have been like the worst person for Bodden to talk to, because he was being lied to by the British military about the effects of, full metal jacket bullets, because some of the bullets that he thought were full metal jacket bullets were almost certainly dum-dum bullets that have been tampered with. Anyhow, so Sturdivan was kind of he was part of the dog and pony show. The medical panel, you never see any of the books by Bodden or Weck, any of them ever talk about, and then we talked to Larry Sturdivan and he told us this. None of them even mention him. But he did eventually write a book, and his book was all about the test and the wound ballistics. And one of the things I found, John Hunt found it first, I guess, because he was friendly with Sturdivan when Sturdivan was writing his book. Sturdivan's numbers on what the tests, the tests that were performed for the Warren Commission were to determine the amount of velocity. If a bullet was going to damage the rib in this way, it would lose this amount of velocity. If a bullet was going to damage the wrist in this way, it would lose this amount of velocity. And the numbers didn't add up. And the Warren Commission kind of got around it by saying it would lose substantially more energy if a bullet was, traveling sideways or something. They got around it because the tests didn't actually add up. And then in Sturdivan's book, it gets even worse because he just changes the numbers. like Dr. Olivier, they replicated. They actually shot on cadavers. They actually took human arms and shot them to try to reproduce the damage to the wrist. And when they did, they said I think it was 82. It didn't lose very much because it only ticked the bone at an angle. It was like 82 feet per second is all it lost while traveling through the wrist. But if it only lost 82 feet per second, based upon their other numbers, it would have been traveling, at a substantial speed when it hit the thigh, and it would have embedded it in the bone of the leg. But the doctors, Connolly's doctors, said, no, the bullet didn't it didn't actually embed in the leg. It was just a surface wound, and there was one tiny fragment, which one of the doctors thought, but was in the bone. But the radiologist says, no, it's actually just barely below the skin in the fat on the leg. So they had this problem. It's like, well, where'd all this velocity go? So in Sturdivan's book, he just says, when the bullet went through the wrist, it lost 400 feet per second or whatever. In opposition to all the tests done by his wound ballistics lab, which showed that it would be 82 feet per second. I think in his book, he says it's 300 or 400 feet per second that would have lost on the wrist. And he does it over and over again. He just changes the numbers to try to make sense of them, but it's not based on the tests that were actually performed. Because if the tests that were actually performed suggest that the bullet that hit Connolly was probably traveling at a low velocity bullet, not a full metal jacket bullet fired from the rifle that they claim was Oswald's rifle, a military rifle. And that's one of the things that was covered up by the Warren Commission and the HSCA. They both hid that, And then one of the things also interesting about Sturdivan's testimony is that there's an exhibit that he brought forward, which in the transcript, it says that the bullet in that exhibit is traveling 800 feet per second. 800 meters per second. It's an M16 bullet. But I looked at it, and the bullet is it's a bullet going through I guess it's ballistic gelatin, and it didn't seem like it was going very fast. And I'm like, that doesn't look right. But I didn't think that much of it. But then I was looking through the book Mortal Error, and there they had a card or a piece of paper that was handed out as all the exhibits were shown during the HSCA testimony. And there it said it was a bullet traveling at 800 feet per second, not 800 meters per second. And so that was a subsonic bullet. And so that means that Sturdivan's laboratory where he worked was actually studying bullets where the charge had been reduced, so it would take away the crack of the bullet traveling at a supersonic velocity. So they were assassination bullets. They're bullets because in the 90s, an assassination manual got released, perhaps on accident. That was part of the Guatemala documents, the Operation Success documents. And there was a manual that the CIA prepared on how to commit an assassination. And in there, it talked about how you could take a low caliber bullet, like a 22 caliber bullet, and reduce some of the powder charge in it so that it was a subsonic as opposed to supersonic. And then you could fire back from inside a building and no one would know where you were, is what it says in the book. It says can be used with great success to assassinate people nearby people within 100 yards. And so to me, that's the Daltex and the Records Building and some of these other locations were within range for someone to be firing subsonic bullets. Anyhow, this was something that was actually tested by Sturdivan's group. So I wanted to get the testimony, and I contacted him. He says, I don't remember what I said. But he said, looking at that exhibit, I think he says, I don't think that is 800 meters per second. And then I found his testimony. I finally got access to his testimony, and he says, this is a bullet traveling 800 meters downrange, is what he said. So that'll be on the recording that you had. He says that the bullet was traveling 800 meters downrange, and which would be like a bullet that's slowing down way past its target. Anyhow, but the point is that was removed from the transcript, so it makes it look like the bullet was traveling full velocity in that exhibit. And I've read a few other books on sniping and assassinations, and it's in there that the federal government to this day guards a lot of information about subsonic ammunition that's made where people can't hear it, to make it silent. Silencers, a lot of silencers are still top secret. A lot of silencers are still top secret.
Right. Okay. So the thing about his testimony is, it's not really revelations or exposing anything. It's kind of confusing the facts, obfuscating, if you will.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like I said, in his testimony, he says that the bullet, upon impact with Connolly's wrist, the bullet was traveling at 1,100 to 1,300 feet per second. And then he just never mentions the amount of velocity it would lose within Connolly's wrist or the amount of velocity it would have upon hitting Connolly's thigh. Because if the bullet was traveling 1,100 to 1,300 feet per second upon hitting Connolly's wrist, his, the test performed for the Warren Commission would show that it would lose hardly anything going through the wrist and hardly anything hitting the thigh. So it would be, hit the thigh at like 1,000 feet per second, which would be a typical gunshot wound. And like I said, the doctors, Connolly's doctors said, no, it was just a little tiny fragment that barely, broke the surface of the skin. I don't even think they gave him any stitches for it.
Right, but they're trying to claim that what came out of his leg was Commission Exhibit 399.
Exactly.
And I think what they said is it developed reverse trajectory momentum.
They said that it, hit and like stuck in a little bit and then fell out later on the.
Right, I mean, that's how they explain falling out. Developed reverse trajectory momentum, falling out. I mean, that's what the joke, right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I get it.
But the thing here
doesn't make any sense. And that's the kind of thing they would say, just total BS. And but yeah, Sturdivan's testimony, he's running around that like you can't believe. He's avoiding like the plague. And another thing that he says interesting. See, the actual test, they tried to reproduce Connolly's chest wound, and they found that it lost about 400 feet per second. They lost 268, I think it was, feet per second when they shot a goat, and they said Connolly's a bit bigger, it would lose a little more. Okay, 400 feet per second. This is the Warren Commission testimony of Doctors Olivier and Zemian. So Sturdivan, in his HSCA testimony, he says it would lose about 400 feet per second. But if it only lost 400 feet per second going through Connolly's chest, like I said, then it would end up being going 1,100 to 1,300 feet per second when it hit his wrist, and it just wouldn't make any sense. So in his book, Sturdivan turns that 400. He has it traveling between 1,100 and 1,500 feet per second. So he just arbitrarily adds 700 to 1,000 feet per second onto the amount of energy it would lose, amount of velocity it would lose during going through the chest, not based on any test, but because he's trying to make the numbers work. And you see that over and over again, not just with Sturdivan's book, but with the Warren Commission and a lot of other single assassin theorists out there, where they just offer up stuff which they pretend is science, and they have a lot of people convinced it's science, but they're just making it up to try to make sense. How can we have this guy Oswald be the only guy firing? How can we have him firing this rifle from this building and hit all these shots? And so they just fudged over and over again, and that was
they lied. I mean,
they lied. When people want to believe something, they find a way to twist things. Some of the people, I think, really believed Oswald did it, and they twisted it around, hoping they were right. But I think some people knew they were lying, and that's the tough. One of the tough parts is separating out who was deliberately lying versus who was just a true believer,
Well, the only problem is that today, if you want to believe that there was a lone assassin, you have to cling to this false material. And that's what I'm hoping that people can dig out and thanks to you and other researchers, recognize what is made up documents, what's just phony, so that people can't just keep waving these up and saying, well, this is what the expert said. And then you realize the guy's been compromised. Like, for me, they tested the rifle against the rifling of Commission Exhibit 399, and they don't match. And when I did one episode on the rifle in 50 Reasons for 50 years.
For the HSCA,
Yeah, I mean,
I think the HSCA rifle, the guys who looked at the rifle, said, well, the rifle was fired a number of times during the Warren Commission's investigation, and that must have changed the way that the rifling was done, because they do change over time. So they said, so we'll trust the original, reports of by Robert Fraser and the FBI. We'll just trust what they said, even though it doesn't match now.
Right. There's the lie. Okay, that's the lie. So people who want to cling to that, it's like the Flat Earth Society. You can just believe what you want to believe, but if you want to understand the facts, when they tested and they examined test firings from the rifle, I mean, otherwise you should throw out every criminal examination where they said, well, the gun must have changed. We fired too many bullets, right? I mean, how many is too many?
I think it was really like 60 times or something. It wasn't like they shot it hundreds of times. It was, they fired it. The military fired it. The FBI fired it a few times, and then the military ran some tests with it. Altogether, it was fired, I'm pretty sure, less than 100 times. And would a rifle change its, that much in 100 with 100 firings? I don't think so. But yeah, that was I found that interesting too.
No, it's like
Well,
a
one of the other
fingerprint.
things that's very interesting is that the Warren Commission spent an awful lot of their investigation trying to show how the scope would have helped Oswald and how anybody could commit an assassination with one of these scopes. It made it really easy for Oswald to do it. But then the HSCA guys, their ballistics experts were like, "Are you kidding? When a car is traveling across and you have the scope, which is it's bringing it really like in focus, but it makes everything drive out of sight much faster. It makes it a lot harder to make your target." They ruled that he didn't use the scope. The HSCA guy said, "No, he didn't use the scope. He couldn't have used that scope on that."
Yeah, he couldn't have used the scope.
Yeah. And so then Blakey and Cornwell, because they were desperate to make everything line up, they had the dictabelt suggested that the first two shots were both fired from the sniper's desk, but like within like a second and a half, 1.7 or whatever, much faster than anybody thought that Oswald could fire the rifle. So Blakey and Cornwell, at the last minute, they went and they got a Carcano rifle. I don't think they used the original one. And they went out there and they fired it as fast as they could fire it. And they said, "Look, we're not even professional shooters, and we were able to fire it within that time, but we weren't really aiming." They call it point aiming, which is you just kind of like, the end of the rifle is pointing in that direction. And so the irony is that they claimed, the HSCA's finding was that the first shot missed at 160 from the Z160, and then a second and a half later, so the second shot was the single bullet theory shot. So their single bullet theory is even better than the Warren Commission's because they have Oswald hit Kennedy and Connolly without even aiming. And I'm not making that up.
Yeah.
That's what they came up with.
Without even aiming. I mean,
he pointed the rifle in the general direction, and of course, whenever that happens, you're a guy traveling 90 yards away, a moving target. You hit your target wrong. And there's no evidence that Oswald was ever trained to fire that way or ever practiced firing that way. It doesn't make any sense. But that's what Blakey and Cornwell both went there and they offered it up at the last minute because they were trying to keep all the congressmen in line, and they wanted all the evidence to line up to the single bullet theory. They wanted it all to line up and work because they wanted to answer those questions. Gaten Fonzie, in his book The Last Investigation, which is pretty much a book you can't plug enough, he talked about that was Blakey came in there and said, "We're going to make everything make sense." And part of making everything make sense is to put square pegs into round holes.
It's a great failing of that. Is this is such an important event.
Oh, as an American, I'm embarrassed. Yeah, I'm embarrassed that it was handled that way, and they didn't get any closer to the truth than the Warren Commission, or they probably did on a few things. To Blakey's credit, they recognized that Jack Ruby was not just a just a guy who loved Kennedy. They recognized that he had mob connections, and they did. The HSCA did a few things right.
Yeah, I think that was in spite of Blakey. That was people that went around behind his back and dug up stuff. And when you listen to Ed Lopez, Dan Hardway, they were kind of working behind the scenes. And at the end, he replied back to Blakey. He says, "We shouldn't have put all our eggs in one basket. You shouldn't have just clung to the Oswald did it theory, because now you're going to have to admit conspiracy, and you haven't done any investigation." And Blakey has to be held accountable for that, right?
So they put out, well, we think maybe the mob was involved, and then Blakey put out his book saying he thought the mob definitely was involved, which, I think they were involved on some level, but I don't think they were the master.
Imagine the poverty of that statement, that you've just recognized that some organized crime has killed your president, and it's taken you how many years later to let some professor like Robert Blakey discover that, and the FBI, the Secret Service, the intelligence agencies have all failed to the point that it's an embarrassment. That's the best that America has to offer. It's pathetic.
And and also equally embarrassing is, as soon as the HSCA came out and said a probable conspiracy, the media did just about everything they could to say, well, they only said that because of the dictabelt, and we don't trust the dictabelt. The media took this contrarian position. When the Warren Commission came out, they all lined up to embrace it. And then the HSCA comes out and says it's a probable conspiracy. And I don't think there was a single editorial written saying we think they got it right, or let's take them at their word, or whatever. It was just this.
Or this is step one. Now that they've discovered something, everybody knew that the Warren Commission was crooked. Yeah. So in the public opinion, now step two is let's reopen the case.
Yeah, I wasn't, a Kennedy researcher back in the 80s, but I remember going through the whole Reagan presidency, knowing that they said it was a probable conspiracy, waiting for the Reagan Justice Department to tell us, well, who was it? Who was it? And then right before Reagan left office, I can't remember, the Attorney General put out a statement saying, yeah, we decided that it's kind of a cold case and we're not going to really look into it. We think, the dicta belt thing was really a dead end and we're not looking into anything else. It's like, well, hello, what about Marcello and what about Trafficante and what about, the CIA, for Christ's sake? They didn't bother to look at any of that.
Now, why do you think that they say the dicta belt is a dead end?
Well, there were problems with the dicta belt evidence. The HSCA, they kind of oversold it, I think, to a certain degree. I know a lot of people disagree with me on that, but I think the one thing that I always have problems with is the Dorman film, I think, shows McLean coming around the corner long after he was supposed to have already passed that point. But rather than build upon that, there was this whole narrative. There was this whole narrative built up that the only thing the HSC came up with was the dicta belt, and if it's wrong, that means that there's no conspiracy. But that's not true. It's like, the Seth Kanner had written his book where he proved that Ruby was mobbed up all the way around and had all these connections with the mob. The Reagan Justice Department didn't investigate any of that. They did have the tapes, the Brylab tapes or whatever of Marcello's conversations, but those didn't get released for another 20 years or something like that. And maybe he was delusional, maybe he was old, but he did talk on those tapes about the Kennedy assassination and his involvement. That's not my forte. I don't know all of it. I know, I've read some of the transcripts of where maybe he was joking, but still, that's something that the Justice Department should have followed up on, and they did not.
Yeah, well, I think it's a lot higher up the power level with the Allen Dulles, Sullivan Cromwell, things like that. So at a lower level, they have some of these organized crime figures there to take the blame if something goes wrong, and also to spread disinformation. And the professionals that plan this, I mean, this isn't their first operation. And like you mentioned, there's manuals written for this kind of thing. And, one of our guys got inadvertently apprehended, so we have to have a way to get them out. We have to identify people who are on our team, and it's on a need-to-know basis. So we're going to handle special identification that day. And if anyone does inadvertently get arrested, we'll have a way to get them out. Or, deniability. I mean, people were apprehended coming out of the Daltex building.
Right. Yeah, there was a huge can of worms. If they ever were to admit, and say, you know what, there was a probable conspiracy back in the 70s or 80s, then they would have been obligated to look at stuff that nobody wanted to look at. Nobody in Washington wanted to look at that stuff. And another, just to throw it out there, the HSCA was split into two parts. There was one group of congressmen who were responsible for investigating Kennedy's assassination, and one group of congressmen responsible for investigating Martin Luther King's assassination. And they had assistants who paid attention to the other assassination, and both groups ended up voting on the conspiracy, no conspiracy, or whatever angle at the end. But one of the congressmen who was involved in Martin Luther King's investigation was Robert Edgar, a known strong liberal, the kind of guy that you think would be straight up and really get into the investigations. But his assistant that he hired to follow the Kennedy assassination material and report on the Kennedy assassination material was Arlen Specter's son, Shannon Specter. And that's something I didn't realize for years while I was researching it. And how could HSCA allow one of the congressmen who's supposed to be reinvestigating the Warren Commission's investigation to bring in the son of one of the Warren Commission's main investigators as his chief assistant? Yeah, I mean, how can you do that? Isn't that a conflict of interest? How can you bring in the son of one of the Warren Commission's main investigators, the guy inventor of the single bullet theory, to advise you on whether the single bullet theory makes sense? It didn't make it. That's just beyond me. That's just proof of how incestuous all these Washington figures were. They weren't really interested in doing a real investigation, I don't think.
Well, no, that's obvious when they ran Sprague out and, forcing someone like Tannenbaum to quit. Now, the other thing I wanted to bring up, though, was at the Pittsburgh conference, I sat through Tim Thompson going through acoustical evidence with the film. Were you able to sit in on that at all?
Oh, yeah. And he and Robert Groden had almost exact same conclusions, which was interesting because they both have been thinking about it or whatever, and they both came to this conclusion that the final shot was about a half a second after the headshot, I think is what they came up with.
So I think that what I'm saying is that they were making use of acoustical evidence.
Yeah, I'm on the fence about the acoustical evidence. I don't think the way the HSCA lined up the shots was correct, but I'm open-minded that maybe what's on that tape is some sort of record of shots, but I'm not convinced either way at this point.
Well, Groden was saying that the House Select Committee could have asked for shots at various locations and exhausted every avenue of research, and they didn't.
That's true. That's true. They just tested the school book depository versus the grassy knoll. They didn't test other locations. One of the very viable locations, considering they had a witness who said he saw someone with a rifle there, would have been the west window of the sixth floor.
Yeah, or the roof of the Daltex building.
Or the roof of the Daltex building. Correct. It could very well be that they would have sounded close enough where they matched the tapes. Yeah.
And of course, the thing is that you can't fire the gun that way. A single bullet doesn't do all that. So people who somehow try to cling to that do a great failing to the actual investigation of the case. What happened throughout this? Look at Commission Exhibit 399 did not do those wounds. So if you could just get that straight, okay, something else did all those wounds. Start going like that. If you tell someone this is not the JFK case, just tell them it's another case, and you'll have an answer. But when people seem stuck to, well, these scientists in 1978 said that's how it happened, and of course McAdams is the greatest cheerleader for that. They just keep waving this testimony around, and it's taken a lot of years for people to go through. Well, what exactly did they say, and is that possible? It's just a lot of like you said, a smoke and mirrors or a dog and pony show about this testimony and facts and numbers of that bullet. Commission Exhibit 399 does not match the rifling.
Right.
And then if Lee never ordered that gun, and if that gun is not even the gun that Klein's Sporting Goods was, but 36 versus the 40-inch, and it's the whole thing. And if the money order, was never cashed, I mean, it's just pathetic, really.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions, absolutely. And what you said about how the hypocrisy of some of these guys, where they cling to this testimony. One of the funny things, or sad, or however you want to look at it, is that in the mock Oswald trial in 1986, that was eventually broadcast in the United States, I think on Showtime, where Vincent Bugliosi was the prosecuting attorney. He put Cecil Kirk, the head of the HSCA photography panel, he put him on the stand and had him testify that Kennedy was shot before he went behind the sign and that he was hit around frame 190 of the Zapruder film. I believe is what he said. And so maybe he said 200 or whatever, but he said way before Kennedy went behind the sign, he was hit. And then in his book, Bugliosi talks over and over again that, Cecil Kirk testified at the trial, blah, blah, but he never mentions that Kirk told him that, Kennedy was hit behind the sign, that he put Kirk on the stand to say that. And that was one of his arguments proving Oswald's guilt. But now he switched it because the popular theory is that, Kennedy wasn't hit until frame 224, the exact same time Connolly was hit, the single bolt theory works, rah, rah, rah. And when really, if you're going to, if you say the Zapruder film shows Connolly getting hit at frame 224, based upon the HSCA testimony, that means there was a shot at 190 and a shot at 224. Too close to be fired by Oswald's rifle. Therefore, there were two shooters. And that's something which we brought up in the 50th anniversary videos. But it's right there in the HSCA testimony of Cecil Kirk that they had a photography panel. I think it was 18 members, and it was like 12-6. 12 of them said that the Kennedy was shot before he went behind the sign. But you'll never hear that from Bugliosi or Posner. None of those guys will ever admit that.
Right, because it admits the failing. And these guys, they'll jump around. As soon as you pin them down on something and you can say, listen, your synopsis of the facts, your hypothesis, it cannot be true. They just drop that and move to something else.
Well, I've actually exchanged emails with two members of the Warren Commission staff, Howard Willens and Burt Griffin. And both of them, when you start to ask questions about why doesn't this Kennedy does look like he was hit before he went behind the sign and that kind of stuff, then they always just go, well, then present me with another scenario that makes more sense. Well, they've already decided that Oswald being the lone assassin makes sense to them. So then no matter what you say, you're going to be wrong. So the details become irrelevant. when they start to go against the Oswald did it conclusion.
Now, once again, the poverty of that. The details become irrelevant.
Yeah.
I mean,
that was
the
right
other
there.
scenario is more than one gunman.
Yeah.
And more than one gunman means possibly no one shooting from the sniper's nest. It was a setup job there to leave a rifle there. And like you're saying, where the other gunshots came from, you can't overemphasize that XY axis as well. The car is traveling down the street, but across the plane as well. And some of these recreations, they just show a target traveling straight, just going straight down. So if you do get your sight on it, you could travel with it, not across.
Well, I was saying about it, what part of the Warren Commission Dog and Pony show was to talk about how the scope helped, and also they kept saying how the assassin was firing from directly behind. Oswald was helped by the fact that he was firing directly behind and all this stuff. One of the exhibits, I don't have it that's in the Warren Commission records, is a photograph supposedly showing the trajectory that the car is traveling straight away. But this photograph was taken because the FBI made a mock-up of Dealey Plaza, which I believe that mock-up still exists. And they made a mock-up of Dealey Plaza with, these fake little buildings and everything. But the photograph that shows the trajectory supposedly of the sniper and it shows how it's straight in line was taken from above the Daltex building. So because you can see the 6-4 the school book depository, it's in the photograph. So it's like, wait a second, this is supposedly showing the trajectory of the sniper, but it's coming from the Daltex building. I was like, oh my God, these guys there's no shame.
Yeah, no shame. It's like getting testimony from lawyers for a tobacco company saying, there's no cancer here. Smoking's healthy. Look at all these doctors that have signed up to say smoking's healthy. It's that
Absolutely.
kind of game.
Yeah. There's some good books on that too. I think it might have been, I don't remember the title of the book, but there was a book I read which traced that all back to where people digging tunnels for the railroads were getting silicosis. Sand, minute bits of sand were getting in their lungs and they were dropping like flies. Some of the tunnels like built back in Pennsylvania and stuff, they'd have like 10 or 15 guys die while digging these tunnels. And they hired doctors to say that, no, it's just a coincidence or whatever. And that was what started this whole bit of these corporations hiring these doctors to lie for them, which carries on to this day,
Yeah, Monsanto is the one these days that will just keep telling you that. Well, it's another topic, but that's the same idea. When you get these quote experts, it takes us to go through to find out exactly what are they expert on, and they're expert on just towing the line. Talk a little bit about some of the investigation you've done also on the House Select Committee, because it's more than just Sturdivan.
Right.
But that's the one I'm highlighting today. Who did you want to bring up? I think there was someone else you mentioned you wanted to talk about.
Dr. Humes, was the guy who performed Kennedy's autopsy. A lot of people have their belief that the back of the head was blown out and that the whole thing is a fake. But just play along with me here and say that the whole thing wasn't a fake and that he did a legitimate autopsy and he found a bullet hole low on the back of the head and then he found a large hole on the top of the head and he thought they were connected. Well then, and that's what they said in the autopsy report. Well then, comes a few years later, the Clark panel is supposed to reinvestigate it. And one of the things in Ting Thompson's book shows how for the bullet to enter low on the head and blow out the top of the head, Kennedy would have had to have been leaning way further forward than he really was in the Zapruder film, and how it makes no sense. Dr. Russell Fisher, the head of the Clark panel, eventually, he did an interview with Maryland Medical Journal, and he said in there that one of the reasons why the Clark panel was brought together was to refute the junk in Thompson's book. Anyhow, so one of the things they came up with was like, oh, you know what? The reason why the trajectory didn't make sense for the Warren Commission because the bullet really didn't enter low on the back of the head. It entered high on the back of the head. And so they moved the entrance wound there. But they didn't go back and interview anybody who'd actually seen the body to say whether that was a real bullet hole. They had this red spot, which couldn't, when Dr. Hims was showing the photograph, he said it was just dried blood. And the Clark panel said that was really a bullet entrance. Dr. Russell Morgan, the radiologist on the Clark panel, and he said the x-rays, show that there was a bullet hole there, and he even mentions the size of the bullet hole and everything else. Well, then when eventually the HSCA's job is to kind of say who's right, the autopsy doctors or the Clark panel, they were all friends. Most of them several of them, Dr. Charles Petty and Dr. Werner Spitz, two of the members of the HSCA forensic pathology panel, had actually been Dr. Fisher's assistants And somewhere I found like a book like Who's Who in Maryland from like 1967 or 68, around the time of the Clark panel. And there's 4 people mentioned from the Maryland Medical Examiner's Office, and Dr. Fisher, Dr. Petty, and Dr. Spitz. So amazingly, Dr. Petty and Dr. Spitz end up on the HSCA panel, whose job it is to decide whether Dr. Fisher was right. So of course they're going to say he's right. And then it turns out almost every other doctor on the panel, except for Dr. Wecht, was a close colleague of Dr. Fisher's. So, Humes, who was not a forensic pathologist, he was being, up against 9 forensic pathologists who were all telling him he was wrong, but he was going to stand by his guns. But then they threatened him, and they told him they were going to make him look bad unless he got up there and said that the bullet wound really did enter in the cowlick. And that's the kind of, and that, to me, that's a disgrace. And it's the fact that like some of the single assassin theorists out there still say Dr. Hume said it really was there. It's like, well, he testified. He wrote. He did an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association back in 92 when he kind of like tried to deny that he ever really did think it entered the top of the head. And then the ARB, that's one of the things that they were good at straightening out. And he's like, no, it's where I said it was during the autopsy. So the HSCA got him to play along. And if you listen to the tapes, if you end up playing the Humes tape, they start to say, well, you're 4 inches between where you said it was before and where you say it is now, it's 4 inches difference. And then Humes is like, well, that's a lot. And he starts to like backtrack, and then Cornwell cuts him off because he would put him on the stand for the only purpose he put him on the stand was to get him to say that the medical panel was right and that the bullet really did enter the top of the head. Because that was the only way they could make sense of a bullet entering low and exiting high. Well, now, then Sturdivan and some other people now, have said, oh, well, bullets, when they enter the body, they curve. And so they've changed it now where they say that the bullet entered low in the back of the head and then did a big quick U-turn and blew out the top of his head. And yeah, I don't think anybody's really buying that. But it is interesting that it's changed back. Most of the people who go to the who go to the archives and look at the photos and X-rays now come out saying that the bullet entered low on the back of the head. So right there, if you're Joe Public and you're told the original autopsy said the bullet entered low on the back of the head, and then 5 years later, a panel said no, it entered high on the back of the head, and that's what it was. But now everybody who goes to the archive says it really did enter low on the back of the head. How can you say, oh, we know everything and Oswald's the assassin? But they're not told that. I don't think on my website, I think you probably know, I did a blog where I watched every crappy show that was put on TV for the 50th anniversary and read every article I could find. And I don't think a single one of them mentioned about how, it's the entrance location on the back of the head keeps changing. And there was even a doctor who, for the 50th anniversary, looked at it for Nova. And he came out saying, oh, yeah, the bullet really did enter low on the back of the head. But in the Nova special, they never mentioned like, oh, by the way, for the last, 40 years, we've been told that we've been telling everybody that it entered high on the back of the head. They didn't talk about that. They just said, oh, he confirms the Warren Commission findings. It's very frustrating because they want to present it as a closed case, slam dunk, and it's still a huge mess that might take generations to figure out. But it's gonna come down on the side of conspiracy. I feel confident.
Well, it already has. I mean, just making a false documentary. It's a Gary Mack type of operation, right? Where if they pay you enough, you just lie for them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not one of those people who think that Gary gets up on TV and lies because if he was, he would have said, you know what, I really do think it was Oswald and only Oswald. He still says when pushed, like Jesse Ventura, your friend Jesse, pushed him on his show, and Gary said, you know what, I think there was more to it than Oswald. And so I give Gary some credit for that because it would be very easy based on the people that he hangs out with and the people who pay his check to say, you know what, I was wrong, and I'm really proud to admit that I was wrong, but it really was Oswald all by himself, and he was a crazy guy, and he really did hate Kennedy, and he hated all authority, and he just wanted to kill the president that day, like Posner and some of these people, And what's funny is that they always talk about how conspiracy theorists are obsessed. You look at like Bugliosi's book and Posner's book and their interviews, these are very angry people. And they're not just angry at conspiracy theorists for disagreeing with them. They're still angry at Oswald, this guy who got murdered on TV. They're still really angry at Oswald. That little punk wanted to be famous. how dare he try to be famous? I mean, they're just so angry at him, and it's mind-boggling to me that people have that much anger towards Lee Harvey Oswald at this point in time. Maybe they're angry because they feel their country was put on a wrong track. But if they want to really get angry, I think the Vietnam War was a lot bigger thing, and I think that was in part caused by the Kennedy assassination. But people who are more angry at Lee Harvey Oswald for making America cynical than Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, I think that those people probably belong in an institution, because I think anybody who looks at the big picture of history, Johnson's lies about Vietnam and Nixon's lies about everything, and it's far more egregious than ultimately. Then if Oswald was truly insane, an insane person killing the president of the United States was a terrible thing, but I think that having two presidents who were pathological liars ultimately hurt the country more.
Well, I don't share your optimism for Gary Mack. He's a gutless liar. We all saw him.
Have you ever had him on the show?
No, he was invited to debate Jim DiEugenio to try to stand up to someone who actually knows the case.
Yeah, I don't think Gary's the debater type. I don't think he's ever
No,
debated it.
yeah, well, he's good at making his own shows, and the sixth floor and his operation there are very good at getting funding to make these documentaries that prove Lee Oswald did it. If you go onto the sixth floor museum, you get presented with these headphones, and you just put them on their wireless, and you're led through a mind control maze, and they just tell you what to think. They do say Lee Oswald did it. Gary can try to get out of that by saying, well, he thinks there's something more to it, but that's not at all what every one of his efforts have done since joining the sixth floor, and the atrocious way they have treated Robert Groden, the way the whole city, that they're behind that. They're the headquarters for the cover-up.
Yeah. I was there at the 50th, and it was ridiculous. They had Homeland Security cars everywhere. Like, what? Why? If I understand if the city of Dallas is like, I don't understand really, but I mean,
really, well, think about the poverty of that. What do they think?
Our reputation's at stake here, and we want to keep these conspiracy theorists out of the plaza. But what was Homeland Security doing there? That didn't make any sense to me. It's like, who approved this? Why are we spending federal tax dollars to keep researchers and to keep John Judge out of Dealey Plaza? That didn't make any sense to me.
No, it only makes sense if you realize that they're very afraid of the press actually waking up and saying something's wrong here. And if there's something wrong here, there's something wrong with Martin Luther King's assassination, with Bobby Kennedy's, maybe 9/11 itself. Maybe people are going to wake up, so at all costs they have to keep a cover story going. I mean, all you have to do is have any kind of common sense to look at Commission Exhibit 399. Just look at it and hear the amount of damage they say, and then say how you found it, and then you didn't even find it on the proper stretcher. I mean, it's just
the dog and pony show.
yeah. Or a joke to the people that believe that.
Yeah.
And I urge people not to bother wasting their time arguing with these people. Discuss the facts. And like you've said, you met someone that you didn't agree with, but you got along to talk about it. You were talking about Jack White, I think, right?
Yeah,
Here's somebody that you might say, well, tell me about the Zapruder film or some of your conclusions or what you think. And he said, you know what, I'm not sure I agree with you on all that, but I'm willing to take you as an honest researcher, and you're doing work here. And if we don't agree about something, there's certain things that people are talking about. X-rays, are these even the real X-rays? And when you look at the photos of Kennedy, I mean, I remember one episode somebody interviewed one of the doctors, and they said, well, who washed his hair? I mean, this is a picture of someone the back of their hair is completely all clean, and of course the guy just had his brains blown out, so there was blood everywhere. And they show you this little picture with a little tiny pinhole and say, see, there's the bullet entrance wound, right? And you go, what a joke. Who washed his hair? Because this isn't the autopsy photo. So there is a lot of false information, and there's a lot of, I think what Jim Garrison said, golden apples, things to keep people looking in the wrong direction. And the wrong direction is following Lee Oswald. And as long as you keep talking about him, you're not on the real trail. The real trail of the assassins, like Jim Garrison said, he was on the trail of the assassins, and it was leading to the CIA. It was leading to Allen Dulles, the people heading the Warren Commission, making sure they kept that cover-up going. I personally do not subscribe to Lyndon Johnson being the mastermind, but it couldn't have worked without him
Yeah.
being one of the good old boys, saying, "Look, Lyndon, you're president now," and like his first statement was, "Okay, listen, I'll give you your goddamn war. You just keep me elected." So the Department of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I mean, after you read Operation Northwoods, some of these documents, you get a good idea who you're dealing with. You're not dealing with Boy Scouts, and you're not dealing with a motorcycle gang either. You're dealing with something even tougher than that.
Yeah. They're people that would justify just about anything
Yeah,
to make the world safe for capitalism or whatever their thinking was.
yeah.
We were fighting against an insidious evil called communism, and anything we have to do, including killing innocent people, as long as we stop communism, it's worth it.
Well, yeah, and talk about blowing up 3 buildings, leaving somebody's passport on the ground there that somehow survived the fire, and all of a sudden the first words out of everyone's mouth is, "It's Osama bin Laden." It's these guys in a cave in the middle of nowhere. It might as well be almost in the Bronze Age. Yeah, they've orchestrated this, right? Where did the money come from?
Yeah.
How did these guys get
Saudi
flight
Arabia,
training?
but
Yeah,
we
yeah,
know the
yeah,
answer.
right. And then when they actually do have a report, those 22 pages or however many of them, they're not allowed out. They're state secret because we've discovered that this money leads to Saudi Arabia. We can't let that out. I mean,
Yeah.
people will start thinking for themselves. And I know that's getting off the topic, but we're going to keep back to the Warren Commission. What a no one believed it, and no one of any intelligence believed it. Put it that way. So it forced the House Select Committee to get into operation. And we've seen through the treatment of Ed Lopez and Dan Hardway that once they were inside and they were starting to ask the right questions or the wrong questions, that whole operation was clamped down, and they brought
George Joanides. Yeah.
George Joanides to handle Ed Lopez and Dan Hardway, and they brought him out of retirement.
And if the CIA wasn't covering something up by bringing Joanides in, well, then they're incompetent. You know what I'm saying? They bring the guy in who's the most suspicious person they could possibly bring in. So it's either the CIA was incredibly incompetent in bringing Joanides in, or they were deliberately covering up. I think we know which one it is, but it's just like history. I don't think will shine down on the CIA on this issue. No matter how the files, all of Joanides' files could come out and make him look like he was a choir boy, but it's not going to matter because just the idea that he was the one guy that they brought in there and they didn't tell Blakey that, oh, by the way, he was working with the DRE. It's suspicious as all heck. And I don't think, 100 years from now or 200, anybody who does any research in the future is just going to come to that and say, well, they were lying. Why were they lying?
Well, look, someone asked Blakey last year, if he believed in the single bullet theory, and he said he did. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
David Mantic asked him at the conference. Yeah, he got up and asked him it, right? He on the record, and he said he still believed in it. Everybody groaned. And I think I was going to ask the next question. So my question was, Regis Blayhut was a CIA guy who was found, discovered breaking into the HSCA safe to look at the autopsy photos. And I said, well, if the CIA was lying to you about other stuff, they told you that he was just a one-off guy working on his own and he made a mistake. I said, isn't it possible that the CIA was, involved in doing something then also? He says, no, he was just a jerk working on his own. I'm like, why do you want to hold on to that? Why aren't you open-minded that maybe Blayhut was doing something on behalf of somebody,
because it's going to expose the real failing of Blakey, that he can't really reveal.
He trusted the CIA.
blunder.
That was his biggest failing of all, that he trusted the CIA to tell him the truth. When, he thought that Gaten Fonzie was the bad guy because Gaten Fonzie was wasting all this money looking for Maurice Bishop, because he was interfering with his orderly investigation when he should have been, listening to Fonzie and not worried so much about the other stuff, I don't think. Being nice with the CIA and all that.
Right. Okay, well, I think we've covered a fair bit for now. We talked about Larry Sturdivan. You mentioned Humes and how compromised that whole thing might have been. Anything else you want to bring up then before we wrap up?
Just to reiterate that Dr. Gwynn was the guy who convinced the Blakey and everybody else that the single bullet theory worked because the bullet fragment in Connolly's wrist matched the magic bullet. But a lot of researchers have spent a lot of time trying to show that his methodology was flawed. But it wasn't his methodology that was flawed. He cherry-picked his data, and one of the things that's based upon every article, because he was the number one guy doing comparative bullet lead at the time, he wrote a number of articles, and you read through his articles, which I have, and you realize that he disregarded all of his own articles and all of his, what justifies saying that 2 bullets matched. He overlooked everything he'd ever written in order to say that the magic bullet matched the wrist fragment. And so he was bending way over backwards to try to make the data fit what he wanted to believe or what he was told to believe. And I don't know if anybody's ever done any research into Gwynn to see if he had any ties to the intelligence community, but I wouldn't be surprised at all because, like I said, his tests sent the whole thing off track, and he was lying. One of the proofs that he was lying is that he said that silver matched. The numbers didn't really quite line right. So then a year later, he wrote an article which he showed to his fellow nuclear physicist, and he published it in one of the journals. And in that article, he changed the numbers that he testified to. He only ran the test, over a course of, I think, 2 days. It's 1977. But in 1980, his numbers are different than they were in 1979. And it's because he was trying to show his colleagues something that they would believe. First, he told that the HSCA was something he thought they'd believe, and then he realized that wasn't going to pass muster. And I'm guessing that's why he changed the numbers. But anyhow, his numbers changed. So the whole HSCA might have been compromised by the intelligence community from the get-go, as far as like I said, Gwynn's tests.
Well, it was, and I'm just trying to get to the bottom of it. I mean, Joan Mellon was talking about some of the other people and try to get people off the idea that it's only George Joanides. And
Right.
Robert Grodin's quote is "take your pick," but I'm just trying to see if you can offer any.
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying is, if anybody who wants to continue on the research that Jeff Morty's done into Joanides, they might want to go into Vincent Gwynn and see what his full background is, besides being a famous scientist. What was he? Was it a lot of his money coming from the intelligence community? Was he getting secret funding from them? I don't know. I don't think anybody at this point knows. Someone should find out, though.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a good thing to bring up, because we are asking people new to the investigation that if they're interested, that there's a tidbit, there's an item that you should go through, and you have a website. I'm just going to ask people to email you. So mention your website right now.
PatSpeer.com, PatSpeer.com, and people can email me at pat@patspeer.com.
And do you want to mention your video?
I have a video series which I did when I was first starting off in this journey, The Mysterious Death of Number 35, and you can find it on YouTube, but it's also on my website. You can watch the videos there too. And then, of course, there's the videos I did with you last year.
Right. And once again, thank you for that. And I should say that, they're getting a lot of views. A lot of people are going through them. They're shared many other places, so Conspiracy Scope has way more views than we do. So they've been mirrored everywhere.
Right.
And that's one good thing. And what we talk about, these failings, we picked 50 reasons. There could have been a lot more. Jesse Ventura's book was 63 reasons.
Right.
And there's many
Maybe
more.
we'll be around to do 100 reasons in 100 years. Just kidding.
Well, the idea was that I thought by doing this 50, that would put Gary Mack and these guys in their place, saying, listen, it's just not believable. And in no episode did we say who killed JFK, or even did we imply. I think we imply that on episode 44, that the headquarters of the cover-up and the people who had the most to lose were working for the CIA. Now, Fletcher Prouty told me many times the most important letter in that is the A. It's an agency. And he says, think about who does it really work for? It's like a law firm working for a client. So who is the CIA working for? And is it the Department of Defense, or is it something higher? That Allen Dulles, Sullivan Cromwell, those guys? So anyway, we didn't, maybe if we do something else, we'll get into that further. But the failings, and I called it the fraud of the Warren Commission, there's 50 reasons, and I think every episode delves into 3 or 4 major points.
Yeah, and it's just amazing that some people, if someone said, you know what, I just feel that Oswald did it, but yeah, there's a lot of reasons to believe he did, that there was more to it. I would respect them, but so many of the single assassin theorists or the journalists who claim they know a lot or whatever, they take this approach that like all the evidence points to Oswald, and it's like, hello, like you said, it truly is a flat Earth society. All the evidence points to Oswald, every bit of it, really? I just can't. That doesn't make any sense. But some people are still playing that game. Yeah.
Yeah, and you wonder if they're playing the game on orders, if they're paid to. How far in the intelligence community do you have people going on the internet to just do that? I remember one time somebody was studying Gary Mack, and they said in one day he had to have spent 8 hours on the internet because he was writing in different forums. And I forget who told me that, but they had said he posted this, that he posted that, and they made a study of this one day. And he must have gone to work, and all he did was sit on the forums and try to refute things and
Right.
keep blaming Lee Oswald. Don't look over here, look over there. And
Well, Gary no longer writes, but yeah, but he sends people emails sometimes, and sometimes I've received a few of his emails over the years, and sometimes they were quite lengthy, and it's like, yeah, he seems to be spending a lot of time on it. But yeah, David Von Payne would be a better example, I think, where he definitely spends a significant amount of time on the internet sometimes.
well, good for him. All right, so Pat, thanks for spending time.
All right.
Depending
Thanks,
on what I have here on this House Select Committee testimony that I have, I may have you back again to talk about something else because there's an awful lot here, and I really want people to know that when they're hearing somebody like a Cecil Kirk or McCamey or Humes or Baden or any of these guys, that there's more to the story, that there's just more, that what they're saying here is what they've been briefed to say. I'm not sure if you really elaborated as much as you could have,
Oh.
but they were told you can change your testimony. Maybe let's go over that again. You told me in an earlier phone call that when they were given their testimony, they were actually allowed to make changes for it before it was going into the record.
Right. The transcripts were sculpted, where sometimes people said something, they said a name incorrectly or something like that, and they would they correct the spelling, but a lot of times sometimes it was grammatical errors, but a lot of times I noticed in Dr. Bond's testimony it was actually substantive. He would say like, "Oh, Dr. Hume said this in a report," and then it would say like, "Dr. Hume said this in a testimony" or whatever. They would change what he said to make him seem like he was more on the ball, and sometimes it actually changed whether he was lying to the committee or not. And it's very curious to me that when a guy went back later and changed it, did they show all those changes to the congressmen who were there?
No, I think that what you were implying to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, you said that they gave the people testifying their own testimony, so they had a chance to correct themselves, that they could make changes before they handed it back in.
Yeah, they did. They did. I think Jack White even confirmed that. Sturdivan said that he wasn't given that opportunity. He insisted he was not. But Jack White said, yeah, they did. They allowed me to change stuff. And because of Dr. Bodden's testimony, I compared what he said versus what was on the tapes, and and virtually I'd say every 2 sentences or so, there would be like a different word or something was changed to flow better or like changed. Like I said, sometimes he said things which were flat out wrong, like, "Oh, Dr. Hume said this in his testimony," like I said, but even Dr. Humes hadn't said it in his testimony. And so then it would say, like, "There's a memo that says this," or whatever. It would be different. Someone was going through and correcting Bodden's mistakes to make it seem like he was totally on the ball when he was not. And and I have a feeling that happened with I know that happened with the Warren Commission as far as the FBI, and also with Jackie Kennedy's. And interestingly enough, Jackie Kennedy's testimony, they cut some words out because she talked about Connolly squealing like a pig when he got shot, and they said, well, that's in bad taste, so they cut that out. But they never asked her to cut it out. They just did it on their own. They I think it was maybe Katzenbach and maybe Robert Kennedy had something to do with it, but Jackie Kennedy was not allowed to change her own testimony. Other people did it for her because they wanted to preserve that she was this really ladylike when she was she was in a state of mourning, and but anyhow, they edited her testimony without her approval. And I think that happened quite a bit. I wouldn't be surprised, Interestingly enough, the National Archives, like a year, maybe 2 years ago, I don't know, somewhere in the last year or so, they put up tons of the Warren Commission's files online. where you can get access to them, including seeing under the Jacqueline Kennedy file. They have the original transcript of her testimony, and they have like the handwritten notations of changing it, so you can see where they changed a lot of her testimony. And it's very interesting to see that some of that stuff's actually online now.
Can you
It
send
makes me
me
think
a
that maybe
link?
someone at the archives actually is like, rooting for the conspiracy community or the research community. I'm sorry. Someone's sympathetic because they put up some of that information, and without, I don't think too many people were like campaigning to get that information, but now it's available.
Do you have a link to that at all? Do you have that link?
I can find you the link to that. Yeah.
Yeah, if you send me that, I'll put that under the show notes as well.
Yeah, I on my website, I a couple of the documents I found in those files that were not in the Mary Farrell website. So some of those I created links on my own website so that people who weren't looking for that, and including one of the things that was in there was Ralph Youngblood, Senator Ralph Youngblood. I'm sorry, Yarborough, Rufus Youngblood, Ralph Yarborough, Senator Ralph Yarborough. He wrote a statement which was put in the Warren Commission's records. I think it was in June of '64, which he said that he'd smelled smoke or whatever. But he'd actually written a letter to Earl Warren in December of '63, saying like, "Yeah, I smelled smoke while I was going through Dealey Plaza." Blah blah blah. And so that's interesting. That's in a personal letter that he wrote Warren, which ended up in the Warren Commission's files, but was never published as part of the Warren Commission's records. And now it's there in these personal files, I think they call them personnel files. No, I don't remember. I'll have to look up the link. But there's these files of people that the Warren Commission either interviewed or were thinking about interviewing, and so they created files of all the documents, mostly FBI records, linking to that person. But then they also included like personal correspondence with those people, including like saying, "Hey, we want you to testify in such and such a date," and stuff like that. And another one that's interesting that I found in there is that L.D. Montgomery, the guy who supposedly found the paper bag in the sniper's nest, about a month before he was interviewed, where he talked about the bag, he was interviewed about Oswald, because he was one of the guys who walked Oswald down to his doom. And he was interviewed about that. And in the notes to Bert Griffin, the Warren Commission counsel who took that testimony, in his notes he says that, the bag was sitting on top of a box, which of course eventually they said it was laying on the floor. So it raises, there's so many problems with that paper bag that I've been thinking about. I actually have a couple chapters on my website about that. But anyhow, that's the kind of thing that is still in the archives that most people haven't seen. And I found a couple of myself, and I encourage others to look through those files and see if they can find more.
Well, you have to, I think, presuppose that Lee Oswald brought a rifle there and brought it in a bag. And then once you come to the conclusion that he didn't, then it's another dog and pony show.
Yeah, well, why can't the guy who supposedly found the bag tell a coherent story about where he found the bag? It doesn't make any sense. And also Lieutenant Day said he found the bag. That's the official. I think in the Warren report they say that Lieutenant Day who found the bag, but the testimony says that Montgomery found the bag. And then years later, Lieutenant Day was interviewed by the 6-4 Museum, oral history, and he was an old man at the time. But he's like, yeah, they found the bag while I was gone. And then I realized that one of the photos of the press photos of taken of a bag being removed from the building. I don't think it's the bag that's in the archives today, but there he is. Lieutenant J.C. Day is staring at the bag going like, what the heck is this? So he was caught on camera looking at the bag with this look on his face like, I don't understand what this bag is. Where did this bag come from? So so he didn't find the bag in the building at all. And that was just a story that the Warren Commission or Warren Commission's attorneys or whoever put together because they thought the people would buy it. And people like Bugliosi repeated it over and over again. The bag was found in the building by Lieutenant J.C. Day. Well, really? I don't think so.
Didn't they try to find another paper bag that was going to be mailed? It turned up like a month later. Well,
there's a whole question of this bag that was found, I think, in the post office with an address saying that it was supposed to be sent to Oswald or something like that. And it's like, well, who would send Oswald a paper bag? And they sent it to the wrong address or something like that. And so there's a whole weirdness with that. And, I think I read somewhere that someone thought that this was it was a smaller bag, that maybe it was a bag that was supposed to hold like either a magazine that people weren't supposed to actually look at, and then the magazine was stolen out of the bag. I don't know. I don't know enough about how the post office used to ship things. Maybe it was some maybe it was Oswald's subscription to Playboy. Who knows?
One good thing about John Armstrong's work is he's detailed how this gun was not bought and paid for, and not the same gun. I mean, it takes a long time to go through, but when you have a check that was not cashed.
Right. Well, one of the things on a similar vein with that, or maybe not, I don't know, but something I found interesting is that the bag that was eventually put in the archives, the one that supposedly had Oswald's prints on it, was too short to hold the rifle. And on the order form that was found, supposedly that Oswald used to order the rifle, what was it, 36-inch rifle, right? But the actual rifle was a 40-inch that wouldn't fit in the bag. So it's possible that the smoking gun in some ways is that order form, because that makes me think that they created the bag based upon the order form, right? Thinking it was going to be a shorter rifle that would fit in the bag. And then no one actually thought to measure that the rifle. So if the rifle was an actual rifle that Oswald actually ordered, it ends up proving the frame up in a way, because it ends up being that the bag was not made, the bag.
No, but yeah, we're going too far.
Yeah.
He didn't shoot. He didn't order a rifle. He didn't bring the bag. He didn't do any of that. And the real investigation is what really happened. And that's just the way it is. And as we discover more evidence, it does not prove years later that Leo Oswald had some kind of agenda, motive to kill the president, to kill Kennedy, and get away with it. I mean, so we're going to leave it at that. But I think for people who are trying to learn from the past, when you study these House Select Committee hearings, it's an education. Then when you get into the ARB, it's another education. And you just would never dream that people at the top would be have an agenda to cover up rather than really investigate. And the only investigation I think that was going to happen was with Robert Tannenbaum and Sprague, and that they were going to have done something. And you can tell that forces moved to do that. And I think that Ed Lopez and Dan Hardway were kind of under the radar. And because they were asking for so many documents and not really being specific on what they wanted on them, and they had a lot of good coaching from Gate and Fonzie on what really to look for if they were looking for, the actual crime. You don't have to say conspiracy, just the actual crime, and who were the people that were, who were Kennedy's enemies, and what was their arm and their ability to pull this off. Well, it's been interesting to talk to you. So thanks for taking time.
Oh, you're welcome, Len.
Is there anything else that you wanted to bring up before we conclude?
I was just going to say, I welcome people to maybe I can send you a link to go to the archives and go through those files, because like I said, I found several interviews and several documents that were unknown to the research community. And so I think that researchers should go, and whoever you're particularly interested in, go to their file on the archives website and read through that file and see if you spot anything you hadn't seen before.
Okay, good advice. All right, well, I'm looking forward to speaking to you again. So thank you very much for today, and we'll keep in touch.
Okay, thanks, Len.
Okay, bye, Pat.
Okay, all right, bye-bye.
Black Op Radio is pleased to announce a direct download section. That's right. Now you can purchase all archive shows and specialty packages such as the John Armstrong interview, Doug Horn, Jim Douglas, Jim Diogenio, and more. So instead of having to wait with regular mail, you can get shows you want in minutes directly to your computer. Check out the direct download section at blackopradio.com. Orville Nix, the missing JFK assassination film by Gail Nix Jackson. The true story of an ordinary man swept up in extraordinary events. Orville Nix took a home movie in Dealey Plaza of the JFK assassination. The original film is missing, and only copies exist. The Nix film shows the infamous grassy knoll sequence of the JFK assassination in Dealey Plaza. Why was it missing? What did Orville Nix see? Could the U.S. government and mass media be part of a conspiracy to hide the truth from the world? Orville Nix, the missing JFK assassination film, is not the typical JFK assassination book. This book does not attempt to answer who killed JFK, but why we should question actions of the time and why the truth was withheld from the public. Written by his granddaughter, Gail Nix Jackson, in a narrative style, the book shares the story of Orville Nix and how he was intimidated, yet remained adamant to what he witnessed that horrific day. Orville Nix, the missing JFK assassination film, available at GailNixJackson.com. That's GailNixJackson.com. The new book, titled The War State by Michael Swanson, explains the great national transformation that took place and put the Kennedy presidency in the context of the times and reveals never-before published information about the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy would not have been assassinated if he had been president 200 years ago. His assassination took place in the context of the Cold War and the rise of the national security state. Before World War II, the United States was a continental republic. In the decade that followed, it became an imperial superpower. Generals such as Curtis LeMay not only wanted to invade Cuba, but knew that there were short-range missiles on the island armed with nuclear warheads that they could not destroy because they were on mobile launchers. Their invasion could have led to a third world war, and they wanted to go to war anyway. The War State by Michael Swanson reveals why and will show you what President Kennedy was up against. For more information, thewarstate.com. Who was the other man killed in Dallas on November 20th?
Black Op Radio presents Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, the DVD Complete Collection. Finally, the DVD set you've been waiting for is available. Over 15 hours with Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. Over 15 hours. Interviews with Len Osanic, John Judge, David Ratcliffe, and more. This is a one-of-a-kind set. These interviews feature Fletcher Prouty having candid conversations regarding his 23 years in the military, but specifically 9 years in the Pentagon from 1955 to 1964. His inside knowledge is invaluable to researchers of this era of American and world history. These are the revelations you've been waiting for. Over 15 hours with Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, the complete DVD collection. Available at the Colonel Prouty reference site, www.prouty.org, and blackopradio.com. It's a political rally, a free speech zone, a town hall meeting. It's an interrogation at NSA headquarters. Now, it's time to make a statement. Time to represent. Time to let them know who you are. That you're part of the Black Op. With a brand new Black Op Radio t-shirt. Comes in all sizes. Wear it loud and proud. Join the Black Op today. www.blackopradio.com. If you believe there's more to the JFK assassination and the mystery surrounding the CIA and its covert operations, you're not alone. Meet the man Oliver Stone called X in the epic motion picture JFK. Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty comes forward with never-before-seen or heard documentation and information about JFK, the Vietnam War, the CIA, and more on a brand-new CD-ROM. The collected works of Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty is an incredible offer not to be missed. For a limited time only, find the answers surrounding these issues and more with the collected works of Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. Or visit the Colonel Prouty reference site on the World Wide Web, the collected works of Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty.